record on this. Got it. Very good. So we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you that have joined, this is really a follow-up from the meeting we were supposed to have in December. If you all recall, in November, we all came together and talked about the topics of data storage, data management, dissemination, and education. And at that time, we went through the Jamboard, and we're going to do that again today, just more so you can see what we did. But we're going to talk about a summary of each of those topics. And we'll have each of the four presenters that took a topic in November and have them share that with you, or Abby or Joanne, if you're not ready to do that, I'm happy to step in. And then towards the end, after we've had our speakers go through their sections, if you recall, the last time we met, there wasn't a lot of input from our sponsors or vendors. And in between November and now, the 3D Geo team in Minnesota has done some work with vendors to understand more what's available in the commercial space in terms of data storage, management, and dissemination. They did not focus on education, but at the end of this set of presentations, we'll jump into some slides that they have, and I'll show them, and Sean Bond will be joining me to talk through that. So I think we have a pretty full agenda, and we'll just start with the whole notion here, of course, was to start a dialogue about the issues affecting improved LiDAR that's being acquired across the nation now, and the size of that LiDAR, and the issues that go with that in terms of data storage, data management, dissemination, and even educating about the power of this new high density LiDAR. Some of the outcomes that we had really hoped to share or achieve were, we wanted to build a shared understanding of 3D data management and dissemination. And what is happening both in terms of what's happening in the states and or partnerships that are going on there, in terms of activities and practices and the resources that it's taking to manage that environment. We wanted to get a baseline of the current status of 3D data management and education. That, of course, meant hearing from all of you. And then we wanted to establish a list of 3D data management and education challenges and opportunities. If you remember, we captured those in future needs and additional questions to ask, and you'll see some of that in the next slides that come up. And then we wanted to identify some options and some existing and proposed resources for how we might address some of those challenges and opportunities. And we'll get into that more towards the end. So this is the follow-up to that discussion that we began some months ago. So how we're going to do this is we're kind of going to step into the topics as I suggested them before. We'll start out with data storage, and I think Patrick is going to lead us into that. Then we'll jump on to data management with Mark, and data dissemination will follow that. And then we'll wrap it up with education. And then I guess I should have added the vendor input and understanding that we've gained from the Minnesota 3D Geo work that's gone on there. We'll take a look at questions and issues and next steps. Any questions or comments before I go on from anybody? Very good. So before we go too far down, I'm sure this sticky board, I don't want to call it a mess because it's very valuable information, but this is the process we went through, and I think it's a great way to brainstorm when we have a group like this. But I wanted to just remind everybody of how we got where we are. So we used the Jamboard, is the same as what we're using today. And of course, we had some predefined questions for each of the different sections that we're going to go through today. So we will revisit those sections, and I'll ask each of the speakers to talk a little bit about what we were looking for in the hosting. In this case, for instance, the hosting organization, we were really trying to get an understanding of how our states and sponsors doing this now. And you'll see some summaries of that. Then we'll go on to the next questions within that and the next sections And I think we'll pretty much use our time up. So with that, Patrick, I know that you are here and you are our first.
I am here, I think.
Great.
You can hear me. Good.
I can.
Good. So yeah, so we broke up the data storage into two areas, just as a reminder of derived products and not hosted by USGS. And I don't remember the other way. Can you advance to the next slide real quick?
Sure.
And then go back. And then the actual 3DEP data. Who's gonna so go back. So on the data storage side of things, who is actually going to be hosting that data storage? And pretty key in almost all states was at least portions of this are going to be derived in some sort of system by the state clearinghouse, whether that was as we'll see in the next question, cloud on premise or something like that. Or in the case of a lot of states, sort of a host partner organization, it might be a university. I don't know if there's actually any private industry involved, but most parts it was some state agency or an associated partner agency, usually a university or something like that. Could be another university, I think in case of, the open topography, another university involved somehow. Cloud premise, cloud or on premise, it's kind of a mix. Both, a lot of states are doing in some way both options. We didn't go into the question of who is actually doing that and what sort of formats that cloud storage was with, or even on premise for that matter, whether it was actually compressed zip file, if it was raw uncompressed data. We really didn't go into that much detail, but kind of the key takeaway is that people are in some cases moving from the on-premise data storage out to the cloud in a lot of cases, I think, to save some money. And then your data storage best practices. I think the biggest answer to this was things are still to be determined. I think we've all store a lot of data, so we're using practices that we've used in the past. But some things like on-demand archiving, redundancy, all sort of key good best practices for having some access to data, make sure you have some sort of disaster recovery plan enabled and in process. I think as far as why things are being to be determined, at least in the case of Iowa, and I think this is other states as well, is we haven't decided what format we're actually going to store those data sets, which is coming up in another question. So that's all I have for that. Uh-oh.
Dan, you're also muted. Dan, you're still muted. There you go. Oh, you were unmuted and now you're muted again.
I am having some technical difficulties. Somehow the presentation disappeared. Not sure how, so I'm gonna ask you all to bear with me. Linda, maybe you want to stop the recording for a second
Certainly, let me do that.
and bear with me for a second and I will, we are back. I apologize for the losing the presentation, but Patrick, I would ask you to continue with the second one if you would. Thanks.
So next one is the data management and really trying to identify who or, whether there's multiple partners, managing the data, the 3-dep data and using what sort of resources. And I think Mark did this one, actually. I think we skipped the first one.
Oh, I probably did. I apologize.
Nope, it's okay.
I think you're right. It says Mark right here.
I'm wondering if this is a different set of slides because the first
Yeah,
one was
thought there
not summarized. I had 2 slides on data storage and
Dan,
this,
I have a different set of slides. Would you like me to share my screen?
No, because I don't think it's correct, but bear with me for a second here.
I'll put this link in the, and see if it's the correct one, because I know that Joanne summarized her slides.
Well, somehow we ended up with multiples then. Is this the one you're talking about, Patrick? Oh,
let's see, I think I just did.
Yeah, did that one go
Yeah.
back a slide?
Yeah, go back. Yeah, somehow one of the slides didn't make it in there, but that's not a big deal.
Keep going back.
Keep going back one.
There you go. That's the one.
wow. Sorry, it just keeps jumping on me. I'm having some technical difficulties there.
Yeah. So so this is the when we were looking at this as far as the raw data. So basically the products that USGS will be delivering, whether that be the point cloud data or the bare earth model or any of the sort of core data products that are under contract with the USGS 3-dep program. And so again, the same 3 questions: hosting organization, cloud or on-premise, and then data storage best practices. And then most states are host their LiDAR point clouds for their state through clearinghouse or again the state partner. And then some like us in Iowa are probably going to leverage the USGS national map or what other sites that are going to be available for grabbing that data. And right now, the only reason we, at least here, are planning that is we actually have very few users right now who are using the raw LiDAR data, the point clouds. And so again, there's kind of a mix of those hosting locations, university, AWS, USGS combination, Indiana's nonprofit GIS center, other state clearinghouses are majority of those who responded. Again, cloud or on-premise, a mix of these premise and on-premise and cloud. And again, I think this goes back into the follow-up question I had, is whether we let people be leveraging more cloud resources in the future. And I think this again goes back to some of the questions that we asked later on in here in this discussion was what formats people are going to be, possibly using. Are they going to be formats that are more cloud optimized formats, or are we still, at least among state agencies, having to create shares and share that data out in that way. And then lastly, what are your data storage best practices? I think, testing the data for, missing data sets. That happens a lot, especially in the, when you're talking about the LiDAR data where we have tiles and collection of tiles rather than contiguous data sets. Multiple copies, redundancy. I think it's always important to, come up with some DR plan or some disaster recovery plan. And then, kind of just status quo, let it be managed by somebody else. And that's really where people are at. I think that this area, especially sort of best practices, I think is something that we always haven't talked about a lot. I know we don't in Iowa, and I think other states, having some conversations, we probably need to do a better job on the sort of best practices component of that. And there's some deeper questions as far as how people are. I think another question I had related to best practices is, how do you see your users accessing this data? So I think with that, now you can move on to Mark, unless somebody has some questions.
Anybody have questions? All right, I'm going to jump to a different presentation now because I think I somehow created a copy and worked from that. But Mark, hopefully this is what it's supposed to look like to you.
Yeah, sure. So we had, for data management, we had a couple of things for what derived products do you manage and support. So what were those products? And we, as I organized the sticky notes, I ended up with, your standards of DEM, DSM, hillshades, point clouds, and then you got into more of the other derived products of contours, vegetation, somebody making a new topographic map. I think that probably is related to somewhere where there's a geological survey, because I know we do that. As far as our geologic mapping products, we make topographic maps off of the contours, and other various custom projects. So then the other question that came out of this was the product developer, who developed the products that you did, and it was a pretty big variety of some people doing it in-house, some using a private vendor, and then a university or some other model, working with that. And that you could think of, I'm not sure why the university is in there, because it could be still the in-house developer, or it could be a private vendor through the university, however you want to think about it. But the rest of the questions and comments that came up, as far as like the pink stickies at the bottom, very much like Patrick, one of the first things that came up was best practices. If you're going to be doing these things, what's the best way to do it? So I think the development of that best practices in general needs to be addressed at some point by the group. Then the other things that were coming up was some of the tools and some of the programs that were used that you can see and read down there. Next slide. Okay, we're going backwards. Cool. For data management, who will manage the resources? So we had the organization and the opportunities for partnerships, and then what the funding was for how that was going to work, and any types of data governance. As far as managing organizations for the LiDAR data, we had a whole bunch of state geological surveys, and then we had a whole bunch of geographic information offices, and then a few other ones. We see the Montana State Library there. And in both cases, the first two, I'm guessing that a lot of those really are state clearinghouses and where they just happen to be located. Partnerships, we have several coordinating groups that the states have, in partnerships with emergency management, and partnerships with different state agencies. And then as far as the funding is concerned, a lot of state funded, which is great. And then also several from the feds and on the side of the NRCS, which in the agricultural regions has been extremely helpful. Governments and who does your QA, QC, and other issues, backups, et cetera. There's a number where both the state agency and the USGS are doing the QA, QC, and then some where it is just the USGS. And then the QA, QC on the derived products could be in-house or whoever's doing the derived products. So again, trying to read that little sticky at the bottom, it has small font. I know what tools folks are using. Everybody was curious about that. Yeah, thanks. If you can make that a little bit bigger for me. Oh yeah, what are the creation needs and the tech format changes and concerns about bit loss? So in data governance, that was one of the things that really did not get addressed in all of this is, again, we're back to what are the standards and what should we be doing? And so we probably need to write some of that up. And along these lines, it's really a data management plan like you would write if you were writing an NSF or another type of grant that you're doing out there. So if you've ever written a data management plan, that's really what we're talking about in here. What are the curation needs? So that's it for mine. If we don't have any questions or comments, I think that's it for mine, right? I only had 2. Yeah, I didn't. That's Washington. Cool.
Yes, you only had 2. I apologize to everybody. I'm on mute because they are working on this building that I'm in with jackhammers. So.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Hello, this is Abby from Washington. Joanne had another engagement, so I'm taking over for this particular section. So with this section, we were looking at data dissemination. What tools do you utilize to distribute the data? We tried to summarize this with a couple tables just to kind of summarize, the different products that we're actually disseminating. Some of this, we here in Washington, we actually disseminate the DEMs and LAS2. So this may not be a complete picture, but we did want to try to summarize like what types of data you're actually disseminating. To kind of summarize this question of download options, tiled, bundled, or other. We also summarized the question about staff, tech funding, resources, again, with a table, what states do you have staff? How are they supported? Are they grant? Are they permanent? Is it sustained funding? Yeah, kind of a summary of how we're actually disseminating this data, what resources we have to do that. Kind of for our summary, most states use custom portals we found. Some of us use a mix of COTS and custom. So either we customize like Esri tools or other COTS software, or we're just using pure custom products. Most states provide some sort of tiled data for download. I know that in Washington, this makes it easier for a user to like pick out which particular areas they want and just download those pieces. And at least 2 states are looking for additional funding and upgrades to their existing data sharing portals to include staff funding. So, for some of our states, we already have some permanent staff, but a lot of states may not have that and are looking for actual permanent staff because it can be quite a lot of work to keep up with the dissemination. And I think that's just the first slide. Do we have a second slide? Okay, yeah, there we go. So for this, the questions were who leads the dissemination? And it's kind of a mix of agency or committee leads. So for example, here in Washington, we have our DNR, and we work with our Office of the Chief Information Officer, or it might be at a Geospatial Advisory Council who leads the dissemination efforts. So for the question, who is contacted, the stakeholder group, state agency contacts about dissemination. So it's in general, a variety of organizations or interest groups or serve as the primary contact. The question, how are participants contacted? Is it a discussion list, individual outreach, call for participation? Pretty much any of those contact mechanisms, how we get our information out or contact people within our state. And then the question of what information is compiled into what format. Info compiled focus on data requirements and priority AOI. So we primarily gather up, what are our priority AOIs for collection, dissemination, and whatnot. And we did have a couple questions that are outstanding in the pink sticky notes that if we have time to go over at the end, perhaps we will. Yeah, okay, so for this one in particular with Washington, we actually had a survey which we sent out to all of our stakeholders, and what were their needs and requirements, and can we share that to this group, and maybe that would help address some of these like best practices. What are questions or we should be actually be asking, or maybe that's something that could come out of this group. Are there any questions about that? I think we had some pink question notes on the previous slide too, I might have missed. Thank you. Yeah, there was an open question, and it sounds like we're going to get to this at the end. Are there open source or vendor-based solutions out there? I mean, a lot of us are using kind of in-house custom solutions, but as they're kind of a vendor-based solution. And then another open-ended question we had, are states interested in collaborating and sharing resources to build common data dissemination tools? So far, we haven't, I don't think, seen too much of that sharing. Actually, like Washington and Alaska did work together for our initial state portal, but due to some reasons of just being able to handle our own data within our state, we kind of had to move away from that model. But it is a possibility in the future. Maybe that could be something that this group looks at too, is can we share some of these tools or perhaps code for any of our dissemination portals between the different states in the future. I think that was it for my summary. Are there any questions?
Thanks.
I do have a question. This is Jennifer from Minnesota. Did you find anyone or some number of states that are pointing back to the USGS's AWS data source to serve out the data through their own front end application?
Right. I don't think that came up in our summary too much, but it might have come up in one of the others. I think a few states are trying to do that, and that's that's totally fine. And actually, I've asked about the same thing as well. I mean, can we ingest the USGS tools and kind of serve it out through our front end, but they're actually touching the USGS backend? I've asked the USGS about that. We haven't gone too far down the road of trying to develop that, but it does seem like it's a possibility. And I think at least one or two other states are trying to do that.
This is Patrick in Iowa, Jennifer, and I've been looking at that as well right now because our data has not only parts of it. I think it's all official, but it hasn't been broken up into tiles yet, just because not all of our data has been gone through the QA/QC process, but eventually we will be at least pointing to that. And we're also looking at, how, I think on the education side of things, looking at how people can use the requester pays, especially if somebody requests something that's over a certain amount of megabytes, it's just, we're going to say, hey, we don't have the staff people to do this. You're going to have to just create an account and go ahead and do this yourself.
Right, and we certainly kind of thought about that same solution. We do get heavy downloads sometimes. I will say one of the barriers for us moving towards using the USGS website is that it mixes a couple of different formats. You know, right now we have a lot of data that isn't 3DEP. It's a lot of historical data and it's all in a certain format. And we're not sure if just linking directly to the USGS and having it be in those formats like UTM and a different tiling scheme, if that's going to really confuse our users or preclude them from using it. I think we still have a lot of discussion within Washington about that, but that might be one aspect to consider.
Hey, Abby, this is Shayna. And in Illinois, too, we've kind of shied away from tiling directly to the USGS because over the years with different data collections, they've changed their definition of what they're willing to maintain access to, and sometimes quite suddenly. So they might make different decisions than a state would. So rather than having to do that on the fly, we just try to build our own hosting and managing into our plan for that reason.
Yeah, thanks, Gina. That's a really good point. And I think we've seen that a little bit in the past too. I think that, I don't know if there's a possibility of leveraging this group to have a discussion with the USGS about those topics and see how stable those platforms could be, because certainly if we're developing these front ends and hooking into the USGS, we're going to, I guess, be looking for some stability as to, you know, what data we can find and whatnot. But I think it's a great idea. I think a lot of us want to kind of pursue it. I just not quite sure if maybe we need to have a discussion with the USGS and kind of tell them like, these are a couple things we might be looking for, and it would work then for all of us.
I think that would tie in too with the discussion that needs to happen with the USGS because they're so tightly staffed right now. They tend to be QA/QCing new projects only to 3DEP specs, even if other federal partners have paid to buy up. So there's a problem in the front end with what they're willing to review and maybe what they're willing to manage with respect to data parameters or derivatives that just aren't strictly within the 3DEP specifications.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, Sheena.
Thank you for all of that. That's super helpful to hear and to talk about further. I think is important. Keep going with that, but maybe not right now. Thank you.
Right, thanks. Any other questions, or we can move on?
That is a great question. I guess I would ask if there's any USGS folks on the line. You know, is there an opportunity to have that discussion in the future? Sorry to put you on the spot if you are.
There are several of us, and my name's Tracy Fuller. I'm an acting chief of our user engagement section, and we usually have others who are active in the acquisition and some people from our operations as well. So, you know, we'd be glad to set that up. It would help to have these issues clearly identified and written up so that we know what we could address. I understand some of them, others, you know, we would have to get the technical experts involved to be able to deal with it. And you know, we were just on a call internally. We have internal calls, obviously, monthly calls to discuss issues like this. So there are many opportunities to be able to discuss some things there. You know, there are some guidelines and rules that USGS is going down that, you know, for the 3DEP requirements that, you know, it would be, well, we can't say one way or another, but we could at least listen to what you're experiencing, see if there's anything that, you know, or at least answer the questions.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's Rob Dawson with USGS. I think we'd be very interested in talking more on how we share access. You know, we have certainly our APIs, but the limitations within some of that data, and how do we make sure solutions either improve going forward and they're there to be, it's something the state could count on. So I think we may have to develop those future visions together. I mean, we have things like the LiDAR user pay bucket, But right now, our LiDAR distribution primarily is from internal storage for via HTTPS, and that's still available. But does that really meet the needs of what states want? And so a lot of good, I think, opportunities for brainstorming on that.
And I wonder if there's not an opportunity for partnership somehow there with the states to come
Yeah.
up with a solution of where we store it once and use it a bunch. You know, that's kind of one of our philosophies.
Yeah. The idea of a shared service would be, I think, there's lots of rooms to still grow, right?
Yeah,
And mature.
right. Well, thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and move on to data education and education materials. Jim G, are you on the line?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'm gonna let you take it away.
Well, I have to apologize. I totally blew this off and forgot that I was on the hook to do this, but through the magic of Dan, it looks like somebody did the summary, which is great because in looking at the education and the training materials, it's kind of all over the place. And I think we were at the end of the session, so there wasn't, especially on the training side, I think I wrote most of the sticky notes. So anyway, with that, again, all over the place, really your education materials here are mainly three basic groups: your basic users, your stakeholders, and your people making the decisions. And again, those would be probably those last two would be very specific to the place where you're acquiring the information. But I think the basic users has some universality that we could work on. Again, tech topics, the topics for the materials could be all over the place. But again, mainly how to use it, and then you know, how to access data that's out there. Okay, fees and methods. Yeah, methods are everything under the sun, and the fees. I don't know. Are we doing a training slide as well? Is that next?
Yes, that is next.
Okay, I'll forgo that. Yeah, I guess most things are probably free because you know once you produce them, you want people to use them. So let's go on to the next slide if there aren't any questions. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, and as you can see, I wrote a lot of these, which is too unfortunate. Our experience was the users were really hungry for training on the new USGS spec data, you know, starting around 2016, 2017. And we were able to develop with the University of Minnesota and the University of Wisconsin folks some very nice training sessions. And we charged for those because people really wanted to use those, but it was very modest. So it actually made a lot of money, but we also trained 200 people in a couple of years. So it worked out great for everybody. And the other thing about that I think is really important, that was a direct, that allowed us very direct communication with users. You know, I'm from a small business that designs whatever, and how can I use this better? And it was really great to be able to talk to them and hear what they're really trying to do. So so again, they're all over the place, and these topics, and I think that it becomes more important to think about this as the access and availability is increased, and you get more and more people. We got a lot of people who really like to use the last data, and really like to create their own custom projects. And that was a really important part of our training. So I'll stop there and ask questions.
Thanks, Jim. Just more of a comment. We did something similar in Minnesota where we created a bunch of online classes, but at the same time, we had some folks that went around the state and held some regional workshops, if you will, where folks could join in person, and there was a fee for the workshops. But the folks can still go to our web pages and look up those online courses. Now, we know that we have to do that because Minnesota's in the midst of a QL1 collection across the state right now, that we're going to have to redo that. And we had included funding that for that in our request for funding, or request for funding to support that, I guess.
Yep.
Going forward. Because there is a cost of developing those materials, and we're partnering closely with the University of Minnesota.
But there is also a huge benefit to having done that and having the folks using it. As you know, the more you use it, the more benefit there is to society. So.
For sure, I would say, and anybody else on the call from Minnesota might jump in here and share your thoughts, but I would say it definitely increased the use of the data, which of course makes the data more valuable.
Right.
Dan, this is Sean. I would add to that one of the roles that education has to play here is that we have a lot of folks out there who are intimidated by what is LiDAR above and beyond the DEMs and the contours. 90% of our users are using contours and DEMs. Historically, or at least from our first LiDAR collection, we found that people are scared to step into the labs and the point cloud and really work with that. And I see a trend that's changing. All of us are being more immersed into the world of 3D analytics all the time. So that's what we're exploring here in the state of Minnesota is coordination to not only working with this highly voluminous data, but more hands-on experience with point cloud. And then the last thing I wanted to add to that benefited both Minnesota and Wisconsin that Jim is talking about is we developed the training, and then we actually, one of my colleagues actually went over there and used that content that we developed here to share and deliver to the folks in Wisconsin. So really where I'm going with that is saying that a very robust, coordinated approach to what is needed in the world of education is really what's needed by us in all the states and even at the federal level, so that we all know we're talking about the same language and we are using the same terminology, and we understand all of the same common problems and hurdles that need to be overcome to apply this data into our daily routines. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
I agree, Sean. I think education is an opportunity for us where many of us could come together to build some materials that could be used much more broadly than just a single state at a time. All right, with that, we're going to move on. One of the sections I told you in the beginning that we hadn't covered as part of our discussion earlier in November was vendor outreach and input. Sean and I are going to share a little bit about what we've been doing in Minnesota, and it's relevant because we spent time talking with 10 vendors about this whole topic. So I'm going to jump over to a different presentation. I'm going to stop sharing for a bit, and I'm going to load the other presentation. So bear with me for just a second.
Do we have any other questions or comments that folks would like to share? While Dan's making the shift.
I appreciate the conversation about the opportunities. I think we definitely want to explore those as we go forward. Let me know if you can see the new slideshow.
We see it, Dan. Thank you.
And hopefully you see the real slideshow now.
Dan, it looks like ours.
Okay, here we go. So what we wanted to share here was just a little bit about what 3D Geomatics Committee in Minnesota has been doing in terms of LiDAR data storage management dissemination mechanisms. And the reason that we did that, I mentioned earlier that Minnesota is in the midst of working with many partners to bring QL1 data to the entire state. So we know the massive amount of data that that's going to bring us. So we started out with a purpose, and the purpose was we've been talking about what it's going to take to manage this new data going forward. And we really needed to understand and solidify the requirements, and not only the requirements, but the environment that and tools that we would need to support that amount of data storage. We really wanted to be able to manage the data in terms of, we know that applications only last 7 or 8 or 9 years now, but the notion is that we're going to have to add new data and new derived products and new base maps to this tool, whatever tool we're going to use to disseminate. So we have to have tools that help us manage users and downloads and adding new data to the catalog and that sort of thing. So we really wanted to have a conversation with the commercial sector to understand what they're doing in that space. And we really wanted to learn from where they are. We also, this is going to lead us up to possibly an RFP for either a purchase or a build. And we needed to understand where the commercial space was at in terms of, are there products out there already that we could put an RFP out for, or do we need to put an RFP out for development or build it in-house? And then finally, we want to really have a good understanding of where the commercial vendors were going with their roadmap, as this is a big topic that would impact many other states, not just us. Sean, anything you want to add there?
Nothing at this point. Thanks, Dan.
All right. So Sean, do you want to take this slide? You were very involved in the process here.
Well, one of the things we had to do is we had to be mindful that we are, although we are a committee, we are representing the state of Minnesota. And so we handled this like an information inquiry, yet we wanted an informal discussion to come out of it so that we can, build upon what the word that Dan was using in the prior slide there as partnerships. And so what we did is we developed as a team a series of topics. They weren't necessarily questions. Actually, we formulated questions and we bundled them into topics that then allowed us to present that to the vendors so they had a sense of at least what would we like them to think about as they came back to us through our invite. And so as the slide says there, then we had about 10 partners that joined us for the conversation. And so Dan, go ahead and go to the next slide. And we're not going to read through all this. The prior slide there, as Dan, if you just go backwards, there's a lot of text on that slide. The intent is not to read through this, but to have it as a record for what we included or recognized here amongst our team that we wanted to hear from the commercial community, as Dan mentioned. So this was let's call it a formal list of topics. And then that's what the vendors brought to us. And really, it's in two primary categories here. Number one covers an awful lot of the things we've talked about already today. Number two was some lightweight analysis. And one of the things we're struggling here within the state of Minnesota is, how much involvement do we want any one individual user to be able to have with the data? A lot of web-based applications nowadays can put a lot of valuable information up on the screen that may mitigate download. And so these are considerations that we have. That's probably it, Dan.
So what we learned through those conversations with the 10 vendor, we set aside time for each that worked for both parties. And we really discovered that in many ways they're the same, but in other ways they're different. We certainly learned from them that all are involved in acquisition and are already dealing with large amounts of data as part of their LiDAR acquisition activities. Now that also means that they're looking and understanding the need to manage and disseminate that data in some cases. Not everybody that we interviewed, rather 5 of 10 offer data solutions. So that kind of tells you that at least as I interpret it, the market's a bit in transition. They recognize the amounts of data that are coming in. They recognize the challenges that may create. And about 50% of them are already looking at how do we meet some of the needs that we're hearing in the community. We also discovered that most of them are leveraging cloud for their hosting opportunities that they provide. As we looked at that, they suggested to us that if, one of the things you want to look at in terms of, or as you pursue a service, if you're going to do that, or a commercially available product, you're going to want to look at the cost of egress, because that's what you pay for when you move to that cloud environment. So at least as it relates to the cloud, we heard from multiple vendor partners that we need to look at the egress needs that we would expect, because that will dramatically affect your cost beyond storage. And then they suggested that there are new things happening out there in terms of optimizing for the cloud, and we should be considering things like cloud optimized point clouds and things like that as well. So those are some things that we learned on the data storage side. Data management. Sorry, I have a very active mouse. Can you tell? In terms of data management, 4 of 10 had tools out there for management. This was, at least in our minds, very good to hear. And some of the things that they provide are the ability to add new LiDAR or derived products. That was one of the things that we were is really important to us, because this wasn't going to just be a one-time deal for us. Management of downloads. One of the things that we need to do is when you're looking at those costs in terms of downloads from cloud or otherwise, was we recognize that we can't have somebody go in and download an entire state or even a region, just given the size and the cost that may be associated with that. So we wanted to understand how they're managing both in terms of things like file size and downloads, and in terms of users. Users could go a couple different ways. That can mean, do they provide the opportunity to have users in a system where the system might be federated and the users can link to the catalog and add data to the catalog in a federated environment or something like that. So they offer management of users in many cases. And that was generally provided through an administrator tool. And in the multiple cases, that administrative module, if you will, was separate from the viewer capabilities, which we thought made sense. Any questions before I move on? Or we can save them till the end too, if you have them. Okay. Again, 4 of 10 vendors in the data dissemination space or topic. We found that they really provided pretty similar functionality for zip, clip, and ship, similar to what other state portals and delivery mechanisms are that folks are using out there. That functionality seemed to be pretty consistent across the board. I think what we were excited about was some are now providing 3D point cloud viewers and the ability to download point cloud data directly from the viewer, and not only download, but do some basic analytics within that point cloud. And I think that's what Sean was referring to when he said, having some of this analytic capability might reduce the need to download the data, depending on what that is. So I think at least Minnesota as a state is looking to have some of those capabilities in any solution that they would pursue. And then, of course, we found that, and not surprisingly, that multiple vendors were leveraging Esri-based functionality and Poetry, or some of the other products that are out there, rather than completely building their own product. So just to wrap up this section and keep it relatively short, we thought we'd share, some of this with you. Vendors seem to be aware of the need to have systems. So I think there's opportunities for us to have further conversations with the commercial vendors and sponsors that we work with to continue to have a discussion about where do we go with data storage, management, and dissemination. We discovered that several are already actively working on solutions, and we were impressed with the solutions that are out there. We appreciated that they recognized that 3D point cloud viewers are a recognized need, and that they're adding capabilities for that. But we also recognize that more discussion in the community is likely needed to help them. You know, the feedback we as a group can provide them will help them to build better products going forward that we can consume. Solutions seem to recognize that users want flexibility. I should say solutions providers, especially the ability to add new data, provide more analysis opportunities. That would be things like profile viewers, on-screen measurements, height of land, those sorts of things, or height of surface, excuse me. And then, of course, with most folks moving to the cloud, I think we're all looking for cost-effective solutions if that's where we end up. And that seems to be something that they're at least aware of and keeping a mindful eye on. And then, of course, you heard me mention the cloud optimization advancements. So really, we're feeling like the commercial space is looking at the entire need. Although we're in process there, it looks promising, at least from our interview processes. That brings us to the end of that presentation. I would ask if anybody has any questions, otherwise I will jump back to the other presentation.
Hi, this is Abby from Washington. I had a quick question. When you're talking to vendors about the size of, the management of the download, like the size of downloads they offer, did they have any recommendations of like how to limit the size of downloads so that people can't download too much and disrupt costs that way? Or is that just a general recommendation, or were there any specifics behind that?
I'll let Sean answer after I'm done here, but they actually had tools in their administrative aspect of their tool that you could set the limits. At least a couple of them had that. Sean, anything to add there?
Nothing to the technicalities of it, but what's interesting when we talk about download size and criteria is something that a lot of us are really immersed in, is recognizing that we have experience around downloading LiDAR and LiDAR derived products, but collectively as a community, we're all in a new world of really recognizing the volumination, the really how voluminous this quality level 1 and even higher quality levels of data is, and how that fits into egress, like Dan talked about in the early slides, is that we didn't come out of this with any one set standard or protocol for what is the limiting amount. That's why I think the community needs to explore this together. And as we talk about cloud optimization, where this is some new buzzwords that are coming into our vocabulary here, is knowing that the costs of downloading can be detrimental to any simplified plan on how we're going to put this data in the hands of the users. So for the sake of stopping myself from rambling too much, I'm a very strong advocate for groups like this today to come together to help all of us understand what is too much to expect for a download. And if it is, how do we parse that data up into manageable units to get it to them? And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. That's of course an issue we're dealing with in Washington too, as we're developing our kind of next iteration of our LiDAR portal and having more boundaries around download, I guess you'd say. So that's definitely a question we're actively researching.
So this question reminds me a lot of when I worked at Iowa State University and just getting started out delivering ortho photos and that in the early 2000s. And we'd always get a notification from the IT team wondering why every day we had 30 gigs worth of data being downloaded. And it's a cost that it's really hard to account for. It's like, how popular is that data? And so this is a question as we move things towards the cloud. You know, again, Sean mentioned about how much is too much, or you know, how much is you know, allowed, that sort of thing. That sort of concept is something that's going to have to be worked out. It's public data because it's been, you know, in some, you know, paid for with public funds, but the cost of delivering that it's a whole new ball game because of the size of this stuff.
And Pat, I'll add to that, it's important for us in Minnesota. We're exploring, you know, what can we put into a robust heads up on-screen experience that may allow a user to accomplish their needs that would then mitigate their need to download the data. So could we invest in more for a richer experience that would allow them, like Dan said, what I mentioned earlier, heads up on-screen analytics is just simple on-screen measurements. The quality level 1 LiDAR data product that we're going to have in the state of Minnesota is really going to allow us to have a lot of certainty and reliability on the data that we could put on screen. So therefore, can we expand our capabilities of, let's say, on-screen measurements? So those are things that we're exploring.
And other workflows, you know, there might
know-
be floodplain engineers or somebody else who they may need access to the data, or they think they do, but really all you need is a cross section and the elevation points along that cross section.
The other end of this cost too is what can all the various users handle? Because early years and still today, you know, the more you get into downstate Illinois, more rural areas, they don't have connectivity still everywhere. They can't handle the file downloads, even if they want the data. And then sophistication. I appreciate your point with improving the user interface so less downloads are necessary. I think it's a great point. We had a guy this week, he wanted to utilize the data for his property, and he did not like the answer of use our online interface for data viewing because he couldn't understand how to use it, and he wanted maps and he wanted contour lines that the data couldn't support. And he called everybody up and down the hallway and emailed them trying to get a different answer from the same team. So the bandwidth and the file usage that users can handle is still also a significant cost just for capability.
I wanted to add that we heard from some of the vendors that they do have different like user account levels to help get at this problem and just sort of funneling people as a general user with a cap per zip file determined by us, and then having another user level that has different maybe size limits or other capabilities too in the app itself. You know, there's a lot of customizable things like that in some of the vendors we heard from, so that you could consider any need to recoup egress costs or work with certain people more directly.
And this is Phil. Did any of your 10 vendors give you any indication that they were looking at potentially a zero egress cost model?
No, not that I heard, Phil.
Yeah.
I guess I would defer to my other Minnesota colleagues. I didn't make all of the 10 presentations. Sean or Jennifer, any thoughts there in terms of?
Well, that's the trouble, is that because I did make them all, they're all like up there in my head, and it's really hard to remember which one said which thing. But I don't recall that anyone used that phrasing, zero egress cost, or like
Right.
that. But that things could be designed such that, and we ask questions like pulling from 3DEP USGS source as a method to reduce those costs. But it was more along the lines of every option is out there than trying to sell that one as a freebie kind of deal. Sean?
Yeah, this is Sean. Just to add to that is one of the things that a lot of the vendors did, even those who did not give us a demonstration of their proprietary platform, they all did caution us on the fact that we should be aware of egress costs. What are the costs to store data? What are the costs for downloading that data? And we know that, but what folds back into some of these conversations from today is that we're all still learning how are people going to use this new high density LiDAR data in the state of Minnesota. We know what people have been using. What we're trying to figure out is what are they going to use? What are they going to be the new expectations, especially as I mentioned earlier, how more and more people are starting to understand the capabilities of the LiDAR point cloud. So we're trying to set ourselves up so that we have a good plan in place to launch, but we also understand that we need to be flexible and that whatever we go with, the path, whatever we choose, that it has flexibility in it so that we can cater to these emerging needs and likely very, very heavy demands on this very dense LiDAR data. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great conversation, which leads us into these next steps kinds of questions. Hopefully you can see what I put up in terms of the presentation. Can I get an affirmative from somebody?
I see it.
Thank you. So the next obvious question is, what are our next steps and where do we go from here? So I documented a couple of the things I heard throughout the conversation here. One of those was a discussion with USGS and perhaps others on a potential partnership for data storage and delivery. The second one I heard was consider the possibility of partnering to create a common set of educational materials. So those would be further discussion topics. But what do we feel our next steps are? And I will say that we do have a presentation, Linda and I, mostly Linda, partnered to put an abstract in for the NSGIC mid-year where we want to present some of the findings and some of the materials from this as well. We think this is going to be part of the Innovation Summit, and we think it's innovative because this is a problem that we need to solve together, and coming together to solve this in an innovative way is going to be important.
Dan, one clarification I would make is I heard USGS say they need sort of a list of specific items,
Sure.
issues. So that's something that we as a community could put together. To facilitate the discussion, exactly.
What else? Some of these fall under 3 already. This is the list of 3DEP data management and outreach issues. Now, what I didn't do here was copy all of the pink or the blue. And if you recall, those are our future questions. I guess what I would ask this group is, do you want to begin to explore those additional questions and keep this conversation, and I don't mean today, keep this conversation going as we pursue further our 3DEP discussions for the year?
Yes.
Okay.
This is Abby from Washington. Oh, I would just agree. I think there's a lot more to discuss here.
Yeah, I think there's some dependencies in those pink items that are need discussion. I think us included, are continuing down a path that is well known. But I think they're, 10 years, 15 years on data collection for us. I think there's some advances in both formats, delivery methods, and the software that we use on a daily basis that we need to start looking at how we can take advantage of that more of an enterprise type way, whereas before in the past it hasn't been looked at that way, at least here.
Okay. So does it make sense then for us to format those into categories and then collectively come together again in the future and continue our conversations about them? I think would be my suggested approach. And I think, Linda, we can do that, of course, offline. To go with that, I think it's really number 4 follows up with that, to identify the options and existing and proposed resources for addressing those questions and concerns and opportunities. They're not all issues. Some of them are, some of them aren't.
Dan, I just wanted to follow up. Karen, is your reference to today's discussion on the state caucus listserv? Or what post, Brian Embley post, are you referencing?
Yeah, his post in the state caucus. Sorry, let me pull it up. I just had it. He had the comment about, let me find it. I'll just read it. For those interested in utilizing AWS to store elevation data, AWS offers a public data program for governments, education, and nonprofits in which they will host your data in AWS in order to make it available to the community. So, and then he talks about New Jersey qualifying for the program at no cost for hosting our elevation data for 2 years, and they just reviewed for another 2-year cycle. So just, I thought to answer Nathan's question about people having experience with AWS, that Brian seems to.
That would be a good connection. I do remember previous discussions, there was some concern of what happens after 2 years.
Right.
Yeah, he recognizes that that's a risk, but he said they just renewed for another 2 years. So, but yeah.
So far, so
who knows
good.
when they pull the rug out from under you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
also,
That's
go
good
ahead, Patrick.
information.
Oh, Nate, sorry. I would also say this discussion is very useful. And Dan, one of the things I'd like to do is it will help. We have our last project year initiating in mid-May and deciding what those tasks will be for the final year. This will be a big influence on that. If we are approved, we have an additional option year. Let me be very careful with that.
Linda, Karen, it would seem like a natural progression.
Right.
To wrap things up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I captured it, but don't be mindful of the spelling.
I've got notes too, Dan. We can combine.
Just trying to do it on screen so everybody can see it and correct me.
Yep.
Or direct me. Oop. I lost the word altogether. How about that? Anything else? I don't know how, it looks like we have about 12 minutes left. Is that correct, Linda?
Yes.
This is Phil. One of the things that we haven't, I don't believe we've directly discussed today, or maybe it's in one of them sticky notes, it is when you start talking derivative products and on the fly generated derivative products, I think we need to give some consideration to then the automated development of associated metadata for those specific subset project level data sets. if nothing else, citation level metadata for when it was cut out and where did it come from and what was the source and, the basics. For an example, Open Topography generates that on a project level when someone defines an area of interest and runs a project and extracts the data.
Other topics?
I'm shocked no one's raising their hand to say, let me do metadata.
Phil, you're talking to me, right? I mean,
I know, and you didn't.
I like the automated part of it, Phil, because it seems to be the part that we get most pushback on and lack of desire to complete, I guess.
Right.
I hesitantly say I'm interested. I am definitely interested, but I think that's super important from a number of different standpoints. A lot of the data that's being collected, I put up a link in there. It's the ARD zone, or ARD 21, which is sort of the intersection of remote sensing and sensor data and that sort of thing. And a lot of what's going to drive that is metadata and concepts like stack and discovery and regular standardized ways of accessing data. So I think it's hugely important.
yeah, and as Phil references, if you've got it's easy enough to do where you are point back to a source metadata record that has all the content information, which is, of course, established as part of the 3DET program, and all you're adding are the change in whatever change, the clip or whatever generalization. So you don't have to repeat all the metadata. You can provide a link back to the source metadata and just say why this one's different than the source.
Other thoughts, comments, questions, things you want to raise for further discussion? Otherwise, I get to turn it back to Linda and Phil. Okay, hearing none, I hope you found today's conversation useful and informative. If you want the slides from Minnesota, I'll also post those, or we'll post those wherever the rest of this information gets posted, Linda.
Yes, thank you, Dan, for taking the lead today, and thank you to the facilitators. I think the next step is coming up with that list of questions, maybe consolidating our information a little bit further and making that resource available to making at least the discussion. We don't have to have all the answers, but making the consolidated responses available to the community. But other than that, I didn't have anything else intended for today. Appreciate the dialogue.
Thank you, everyone. This was awesome.
Yeah.
Lots to think about.
And if you didn't see Karen's post today on the state caucus, I know I needed to check for some reason that particular NSGIC listserv I had set to digest, so I didn't even know it was going on until Phil told me. So I had to go check and change to real responses. So if you haven't seen that dialogue, you might want to check if you're getting it as individual responses or as an end of day digest. All right, go ahead, Dan.
Before you go, Karen, I remember that you were going to kind of summarize that discussion?
Yes, I offered to. Yep.
That would be great to just bring that back to this group, just the summary of the discussion. As I was reading everybody's responses, I think there's some really good information in there about portals and what folks are doing that we hadn't previously captured. So I would appreciate that. we could bring it back.
Sure.
Dan, I also plan to add those links into the 3DEP information hub.
Okay, good.
All right, thank you all. We'll give you 6 minutes back.
Thank
Thanks,
Everybody
you.
Linda.
everybody stay
Thanks,
warm.
Dan.
Yep, you too.
All
Bye.
right, bye all.
Thank you.